I'm Bev Fletcher and I'm an education and social development freelance consultant, and I'm one of the co-authors of this topic guide on non-traditional financing.
My name is Amy Bellinger. I'm an independent education consultant.
We were asked to look into the problem of financing education at the beginning of this year, shortly after the Global Monitoring Report had been released. And at that time, it was estimated that there was around a $38 million financing gap for education. And two real things that had exacerbated that problem. Firstly, that public spending was falling far short, and really only around 25% of countries were committing the recommended 6% of their GNP to education. And the second factor was the fact that donor aid to education had dropped significantly. In fact, between 2009 to 2012, we lost around 20% of education financing for basic levels. Moving forward from 2015, we now have the Sustainable Development Goals, and estimates have been made about the financing gap that might occur from those. So broadly across development, we're looking at a financing need annually of around $4.5 trillion, but the financing gap is looking to be something around $2 to $3 trillion. And in education specifically, we're looking at an investment need of around $330 billion, and a financing gap based on current investment commitments of around $250 billion. So really quite significant and quite daunting figures there. So non-traditional financing is quite an unwieldy term. So what do we actually mean by that? Well, two things really. And the first of those is about finding and raising additional but also sustainable sources of finance. And then secondly, it's about how to spend money more effectively. So we could be looking in that circumstance at things like cash transfers, public-private partnerships, or payment by results. But we really want to make clear here that it's not just about private investment, it's also about involving the public sector. So what evidence do we have that non-traditional financing actually works? Well, the answer to that is very little, and in education even less. We have seen some signs of success in areas of how to spend money more effectively, so looking at things like cash transfers or voucher schemes. But when it comes to instruments to raise more money, things like social impact investing, we have much less experience, and this is only recently happening in education, and in some cases not in developing countries. So given the lack of evidence, why are we talking about non-traditional financing for education? Well, in development more broadly, it has been seen to raise quite large sums, up to around $50 billion.
To evaluate the potential of these non-traditional financing instruments, we assessed them using a variety of criteria. For example, focusing on learning outcomes, equity, efficiency, innovation, the ability of them to support governments. But there should be some caveat in that we had to make this assessment based on very little evidence, and so we've just been able to look at the relative potential of these instruments. In terms of raising funds, we believe that social impact bonds or development impact bonds and debt buy-downs show the most potential. Let's start with social impact bonds or development impact bonds. These are payment by results contracts whereby the government, in the case of a SIB, or the donor, in the case of a DIB, pays for outcomes delivered, and a private investor makes the original investment in the intervention for which they receive a financial return based on those outcomes. We think these have good potential for education because they're strongly linked to learning outcomes. They can, in theory, at least encourage innovation delivery because the implementer is left to deliver how they see fit. They can produce predictable and sustainable funding for the implementer as long as the outcomes are met, and they encourage new sources of funding for education, for example from the private sector. It must be said though that there are only a handful of SIBs and only one DIB in education that are in the process of being implemented, so there is very little evidence on whether they're effective or not. Also at this stage it means that they're costly to implement because there's a great deal of reliance on intermediaries and a lot of data has to be collected to set up the contracts and report on performance. SIBs and DIBs are most relevant for education issues where prevention can lead to later cost savings. So this includes girls' education and early childhood education, which has a lot of evidence about future savings in terms of health and education spend. The example of the education DIB that is currently in the process of being implemented is one in which the UBS Optima Foundation is investing in Educate Girls, which is an Indian NGO delivering support to girls' education. They are being asked to enrol and retain girls in school and improve the learning outcomes of all children in school in Rajasthan. The Children's Investment Foundation will then pay for the social outcomes delivered. This was only announced in the summer and therefore it's too early to provide any evidence. DFID themselves have been exploring an education DIB in Rwanda to improve access to quality secondary education. They've been thinking through a number of issues such as what should DFID's attitude to risk be, what results should they be focusing on, and how much of the DIB should be focused on actually testing and collecting data on the DIB itself or looking at the learning outcomes. Just to briefly touch on a very different instrument to raise additional funds, these are debt buy-downs. This is when a third party buys down part of the principal or a loan and so saves the borrowing country from making those interest repayments. The borrowing country then has to invest that cost saving in development or education projects in this situation. And those buy-downs are released based on outcomes delivered. So we think this has potential because, again, it's linked to learning outcomes. It can provide a source of sustainable and predictable funding for country governments, and it's supporting governments to improve their own education systems. However, like many other instruments, there is little research on how effective this is in practice. Only one debt buy-down in education has taken place so far by DFID about 11 years ago. And it may increase countries' risk of indebtedness. This is really appropriate for countries on either side of the IDA or IBRD graduation threshold, which may still have major education issues to tackle within their education system, but wouldn't have any other means of borrowing. So, for example, Pakistan, Nigeria and Bangladesh in terms of DFID countries. There is one pilot that is currently being thought through, and that's with the Islamic Development Bank and the Global Partnership for Education. This is still in the process of being operationalised, so there's no evidence to draw on as yet. In terms of spending funds effectively, we think that payment by results and public-private partnerships show the most potential. Payment by results is paying for outcomes delivered based on independently verifiable results. We believe these have potential because they can be strongly linked to outcomes, they can provide predictable and sustainable funding as long as the outcomes are delivered, and they can, at least in theory, encourage innovation. However, it must be said that the little evidence there is mixed at the moment, and some NGOs are actually taking less risk when it comes to innovating than more, because the payment by results is so important to their cash flow. DFID actually have implemented an element of payment by results in their Girls Education Challenge programme, whereby 25 projects have 10% of their result payments linked to results. This has been great for having a real focus, or encouraging a real focus on the classroom and on learning outcomes, and in terms of learning, particularly from collecting baseline data. However, it has been extremely complex and time-consuming to set up, and high cost because of the additional legal fees and data that has to be collected. Public-private partnerships also have potential. If set up and managed well, they can enable more children to access quality education regardless of who delivers it. The evidence is mixed, however, on their ability to improve learning outcomes and address equity, and they really do have to be structured and managed in the most appropriate way. Public-private partnerships could be considered, though, where the public sector is unable to deliver and where there are sufficient alternative providers to deliver education on behalf of the government. But the government should still ensure that they are accountable and responsible for education delivered. There are a number of challenges that need to be overcome to move non-traditional financing forwards. First is that there is some confusion about the term non-traditional financing or innovative financing, and it can get caught up in an ideological debate about the private sector. Just to be clear, that non-traditional financing can use funding from private sources as well as public sources, and it can serve the whole education system, not just private providers of education. Secondly, non-traditional financing, to move forward from theory into practice, really needs to have an education issue or two to rally round, and for people to really think through how can the different instruments really help address that education issue. Finally, given the lack of evidence base in non-traditional financing instruments, it's really important that organisations invest in collecting learning and evidence and data from pilots and sharing it with others, so that the evidence base can grow, so that organisations can make more effective judgments on the potential of some of these instruments. To move non-traditional financing forward, we need to work with a range of stakeholders, whether that's civil society and monitoring that it's meeting the needs of the most marginalised, donor governments in supporting some of the data collection, evidence gathering and piloting, whether it's private sector and encouraging them to invest in some of these new instruments, or thought leaders in really thinking through how can some of the education issues be addressed. It's really important that these multi-stakeholder dialogues happen and that people really do rally around education issues. We must be clear that non-traditional financing is not a quick win, and it's still in the very early stages of development. And we must make sure that governments, both domestic governments and donor governments, fulfil their education funding commitments. But we do hope that there is enough potential for organisations to explore it further, and that it will contribute to closing some of the education financing gap.